Welcome to Building Trust in International Partnerships. I'm Julia Gillen, Professor of Literacy Studies in the Department of Linguistics and English Language. I'm indebted to help from my colleagues in my own department and our partner university, the University of Lausanne, in putting together this video. The people who have helped me put this resource together are Oksana Afitska, Verity Elston and Diane. So, after this introduction, I'll be sharing some advice from Oksana Afitska, who is the Director of Internationalisation, Department of Linguistics and English Language. I'll then be sharing a conversation with Verity Elston, Head of Careers Advice for doctoral and postdoctoral researchers at the University of Lausanne. I'll be sharing advice from Diane, a lecturer in the Department of Linguistics and English Language, and finally reflecting on my experience from the Peer-to-Peer Deaf Multiliteracies research into a sustainable approach to the education of deaf children and young adults in the Global South, 2017 to 2020. So to start with Oksana. Oksana said when I asked her, in my view, trusting relationships with international partners start from a mutual desire of two or more partner universities to provoke, sustain and grow collaborative activity for the benefit of all parties. So establishing trust really means willing and working together towards fulfilment of a common goal. In my experience, the strongest and most productive partnerships start from individual connections and expand to include wider networks of colleagues who share similar vision and who are willing to invest their time and resources to facilitate and support the development of those collaborations. It is through this type of engagement that trust between partner institutions is built. It happens via recurring activity of planning together, working together, supporting and advising each other, and accomplishing set goals together. So Verity, I'm very glad to meet you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I was wondering if you'd be kind enough to tell me a little bit about your role and about your experience of building trust, researching internationally.
Sure. So I lead the Career Advice and Counselling Service for the University of Lausanne, specifically with our doctoral candidates and our postdoc researchers. That's through the graduate campus, and we're really a sort of a hub of information for all of our early career researchers. And what I do there, I mean, it's a tripartite role, let's say. The first, most obviously, is working with individuals, so giving individual advice, counselling, and helping them think through their career development. The second is organising workshops and activities to help them with other researchers as well to develop their own competences. And then the third part is really internal and external projects, working with our partners to develop different initiatives.
Right. What tips would you give for people concerned with working internationally, perhaps with new partners internationally, and how they can build trust in new relationships?
So I think there's a twofold answer to that. One is my own experience. I grew up in Ireland. I did my first degree there. I moved to Chicago for my master's and my PhD. I did my fieldwork in Italy. And then I came to Switzerland just as I was finishing up my thesis. And one of the things that was very true, I think, for me in that whole experience was the importance of asking questions, of not assuming that just because it was a new place, and it was quite difficult sometimes, even, you know, in the US, you sort of think, oh, but everybody's a native English speaker, it's the same thing. Not at all. I remember having the most awful imposter syndrome when I arrived in Chicago, just hearing all of these people talking so fast and expressing themselves so easily. And it was only when I started talking about that with friends, American friends, and they sort of said to me, yeah, but that's how we were educated. We were educated to express ourselves, educated to give our opinion, whereas, you know, especially where in the sort of the milieu that I grew up in, we weren't expected to give our our advice or our thoughts weren't expected. So I think, that's one of the big things, is just to ask those questions, to listen, to observe, to understand that just because things are so strange doesn't mean that there isn't an answer, and that you can work out a way to resolve the issue. And I think so the other part of how I would think about this question of doing research internationally is the people who come to me, the people who talk to me. So at Lausanne, we have a very international population. Switzerland in general, in research, we have a lot of people who come to do their doctorate or their postdoc in Switzerland. And what I see a lot of is people who find themselves in a new country, and it can be quite difficult to integrate. Very often people don't speak the local language, and of course in Switzerland we've got 3, 4, 5 languages. So you're already speaking in your second language when you arrive, and suddenly you've got a third language around you. So that can be very tough. So again, I think for me, the answer is asking questions, and not just getting the first response, taking the first response that you get, to keep asking questions, keep asking the same question. Because the response will be different, the answer will be different, and that will give you the perspectives that you need to get a better sense of the whole.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Diane Potts is one of my colleagues who's extremely experienced in international partnerships, so I asked her to share her view.
I'm not sure that establishing trust in international partnerships is any different from establishing trust in any new partnership. The lines that divide nations are not necessarily the most difficult lines to negotiate. But there is the issue of establishing trust when something is new. So I suppose there's 3 things that I think are important in that vein. One is that everyone has a clear understanding of each other's needs. And that's more than just what are we trying to accomplish. It's about what do we need to make it work? What kinds of resources are we going to need from on our own end, on the other end? What kind of time frames? What ways are we going to need the other person to communicate with us? Where are we going to exchange information? So I think the needs have to be made explicit. And part of the reason for making the needs explicit is then, as we continue to work, we can foreground each other's needs. So rather than me saying what I need, I can say, well, one of the things you've said you need is, and here's what I'm trying to do, and essentially, is this working for you? So I think being explicit about needs is important in building trust in any new relationship or partnership. Similarly, the same conversation needs to take place around norms. If I email you, how quickly will you respond? Does that matter? What are our norms for how we talk to each other? How are we going to talk when there's a problem? Can we be direct? How does one go about being direct? How do we make sure things don't fester? So negotiating those norms up front before we ever get started on whatever the project is going to be, and making sure that we know how to work through things before we ever have to work through something. To me, that's an essential part of building trust. And the fact that we can talk about those things up front is in itself a trust-making step. And along with that is forgiveness, because we're all going to make mistakes, and we're not going to follow through. And something that we might think is minor seems big to the other person. Something that seems minor to them may feel big to us. And so I think anytime one is building trust in a relationship, one goes into it in the spirit of forgiveness. And despite how cranky one might feel, including cranky in the context of a lockdown, one puts that in check and begins conversations in the spirit of trust and of trusting.
Finally, I'd like to share some ideas from my own participation in the Peer-to-Peer Deaf Multiliteracies project. This is a project centering on deaf people in India, Uganda and Ghana, led by Ulrika Session at UCLan. The essential idea is to leverage funds and resources from the Global North, as more specifically UCRI, to support educational interventions in the 3 countries. Virtually all participants are deaf. There are 2 tiers of students, deaf young adults, deaf very young children. Our peer tutors are deaf, and we have deaf research assistants. We also work in deaf settings, for example, the Indoor School for the Deaf, a long-established boarding school for deaf children from very young towards college age, the Happy Hands School for the Deaf, a new charity in a sustainable eco-village with our deaf co-participant Sibaji Panda, and we work with partners such as the Delhi Association for Deaf Women. So we work in the project then with people who use sign languages, 3 different sign languages, and are working towards English literacy. I'd say what I learned about establishing trust in international partnerships, one thing was the value of the multiliteracies approach, appreciating that everybody has a developing semiotic repertoire. So this is counter to a deficit perspective on, for example, deafness or childhood. It enables a focus on welcoming multimodal communication and different platforms. So, for example, we had to change our communications technologies when it became that WhatsApp is a very important communications tool for the deaf. We had to learn great patience with different flows and procedures in the different countries. For example, some countries have multiple or very long holidays. We had to show some sensitivity as to when it's best to keep quiet and just listen. For example, I had just 1 meeting in Ghana with stakeholders, but I was the only white person there. I had prepared the things to say, but decided in the course of the meeting, in view of what was said, that it would be wiser actually not to seek to take the public floor, but to have one-to-one conversations with people during the break afterwards. And I do think that was the best thing to decide to do in the moment, even though it was so difficult having gone so far. So finally then, having listened to these contributions, I wonder, what do you think is most important in building trust in international partnerships, both in your own specific context, if this applies, and more generally?